Hello, my lovelies. Welcome back. I'm Jenna, your host. So today we're going to be discussing two different topics in folklore. We have vampires and werewolves. Oh my! So I am loving this series. I might start doing some other series in the podcast as well moving forward, different topics. So today we're going to focus on vampires and werewolves. Let's see what folklore we can get into. So we're going to start with vampires. We're all synonymous with, the blood-sucking creatures that come in, and, typically they have to be invited in so they can cross the threshold, and it's like they're bound by certain things, right? All these different entities, they have like certain things that they can and they can't do. So one of the things with vampires is that they have to be welcomed in. So if you are familiar with anything witchy woo-woo, okay, a welcome mat in front of your front door is actually inviting energy in. So I have a mat in front of my doors, but it says nothing on it. It doesn't say welcome. And the reason for that is because since I work with energy, since I work with otherworldly energies, I don't want to invoke or invite things in that don't have my permission to be here. So whether that's ghosts, whether that's vampires, whether that's just negative energy from somebody that maybe it's just attached to them, I don't want those things in my home. So if you have a welcome mat, maybe we want to change that to just a regular old mat so that we're not welcoming things in. There are things you can do like putting a layer of salt down as a barrier to keep away the yucky energy. So let's talk vampires. Okay, so way back when I was a young teenage girl, there was a TV show that was a Dracula show, and there's been tons of them over the years, but there was this one particular vampire that I just thought was delicious. I really had a crush on him. There was something about his eyes in particular that just kind of hypnotized you, and that is part of the lure of vampires. It's said that their eyes kind of cast a spell on you and kind of bewitch you in some way, shape, or form, and kind of draw you in so that they can feed on you. So let's get into the vampire lore. All right, so I did find the actor that played the Dracula that I'm thinking of. The TV show aired in the 80s and 90s and was called Dracula the Series, and the actor's name was Klaus Bang. So he's a Danish actor and musician. He's still around today. He was the one that it was like there was just something about his eyes. They were mesmerizing. They looked on camera to be like the brightest crystal clear blue that I've seen in a long time, and there was just something about it. He would come in and it was like kind of seductive. Anyways, long tangent short, let's get into the folklore. So the notion of vampirism has existed for millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, Manipuri, and Romans had tales of demons and spirits which are considered precursors to modern vampires. Despite the occurrence of vampiric creatures in these ancient civilizations, the folklore for the entity known today as the vampire originates almost exclusively from early 18th century southeastern Europe, when verbal traditions of many ethnic groups of the region were recorded and published. In the 1800s, the 18th century. In most cases, vampires are revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches, but they can also be created by a malevolent spirit possessing a corpse or by being bitten by a vampire. Belief in such legends became so pervasive that in some areas it caused mass hysteria and even public executions of people believed to be vampires. So we've heard of those stories, right? We've heard of I can't remember the exact time period, but I want to say it would have been, prior to medieval times, that there were instances of bloodsuckers or vampires. And so in order to kill them, they would put a stake through their heart, or they would decapitate them. They would take their head off, because it was believed that by doing either of those things that they couldn't come back to life, right? Like they would stay dead. There were also graves that had cages over them them, so thinking that they couldn't come back out of the grave should they awaken from their slumber. So in really old cemeteries, you will still see things like that you will see metal or iron bars, because iron was another thing that was thought to kill them or to trap them. And so all of these things came from somewhere, right? So the townspeople, the people who were suffering the most from these things, would have come up with these strategies in order to actually protect themselves and the rest of the town from these vampires. So some common attributes of vampires. It is difficult to make a single definitive description of the folkloric vampire, though there are several elements common to many European legends. Vampires were usually reported as bloated in appearance and ruddy, purplish, or dark in color. These characteristics were often attributed to the drinking of blood, which was often seen seeping from the mouth and nose when one was seen in its shroud or coffin, and its left eye was often open, so almost like it was winking at you while it's got blood coming from its mouth or its nose. That would definitely be disturbing. I personally have seen people who have a purplish tone to them, okay? And it is not something that people typically recover well from. So typically it's from like heart issues or circulatory problems. We had a neighbor when I was a small girl that had a heart attack, and the ambulance was there and they were moving him into the ambulance. And of course, everybody in our neighborhood was kind of concerned, like, what's going on? So we came out of our homes trying to see. Of course, this was way back when, and happened to catch a glimpse of him. He had a very unusual color to him. No, he was not a vampire. He passed from a heart attack, but he had like a grayish, greenish, purplish tone to him. And that's because his body couldn't pump the oxygen and the blood flow any longer, and so he looked very, very strange in color. So these people, these entities, these vampires, were associated with death, dying, and blood sucking, and that's why they were so feared in these old towns, these old folklores. That's where the stories came from. So let's see. So it would be clad in the linen shroud that it was buried in, and its teeth, hair, and nails may have grown somewhat, though in general, fangs were not a feature. Chewing sounds were also reportedly emanating from the grave. So when you pass, what happens is the fluid in your body, if you are not embalmed, shrinks, okay? And so your insides begin to decay over time. We know that. And so things that would normally be plump because of blood and fluids in your body start to shrivel, okay? Think of prunes, right? Everything sucks up. So it would appear that the nail starts to grow when in reality the tissue is shrinking back. So it looks like they have long fingernails. Same thing with the face and other parts of the body. They start to sink in. So we've all seen those like old movies where Dracula looks kind of skeletonized, right? So we can see the facial structure more. Everything's very sucked in. You can see like very defined cheekbones and things very sucked in. Why? Well, because all of those things that would have been plumped up because of blood flow no longer are, okay? So that would be some of the things. Now, the chewing sounds that were reportedly emanating from the graves, that's one that I have yet to hear about other than reading it in this analogy. So maybe there were, clawing at the top of the casket, especially if they weren't actually dead, trying to escape, trying to get out of the grave. So how do we create vampires? How does that become a thing? The cause of vampiric generation were many and varied in original folklore. In Slavic and Chinese traditions, any corpse that was jumped over by an animal, particularly a dog or a cat, was feared to become one of the undead. A body with a wound that had not been treated with boiling water was also at risk. In Russian folklore, vampires were said to have once been witches, or people who had rebelled against the Russian Orthodox Church while they were alive. So do you see how there's so many different tales from different places, different people, different beliefs, different backgrounds, different parts of the world, that they all believe that these certain things are what created a vampire? In Albanian folklore, the hampere is the hybrid child of the Karkinoxal, a lycanthropic creature with an iron male shirt. Interesting. Let's see. There's also a legat, a water-dwelling ghost or monster. The hampere sprung of a Karkinoxal, has the unique ability to discern the Karkinoxal from its derives and the expression, also known as the lugat. Okay, that was a little confusing. So basically, this dihampar had the ability to figure out whether it was a lugat or a Karkinoxal. The lugat cannot be seen. He can only be killed by the hampere, who themselves is usually the son of a lugat. Okay, now that's very confusing. So one is a ghost, one is a vampire. That's basically the long and the short of it. In different regions, animals can also be reinventants as lugats. So they can reincarnate the animals into the ghost or the vampire. Also, living people during their sleep. So that's part of where this came from, is the Albanian one, is that they were bitten in their sleep and then they turn into a vampire. How do you prevent them? Cultural practices often arose that were intended to prevent a recently deceased loved one from turning into an undead revenant. Burying a corpse upside down was widespread, as was practicing earthly or placing earthly objects such as scythes or sickles near the grave to justify any demons entering the body or to appease the dead so that it would not wish to arise from its coffin. This method resembles the ancient Greek practice of placing an obelisk in the corpse's mouth to pay the toll to cross the river Styx in the underworld. The coin may also have been intended to ward off any evil spirits from entering the body, and this may have influenced later vampire folklore. This tradition persisted in modern Greek folklore about the Vykolakes. I do not know how to say that word. That is very crazy. Vykolakes. So if somebody knows how to pronounce that, let me know. In which a wax cross and a piece of pottery with the inscription Jesus Christ Conquers were placed on the corpse to prevent the body from becoming a vampire. So in the Greek one, they placed a wax cross and a piece of pottery with the inscription Jesus Christ Conquers over the body to keep it from becoming a vampire. Other methods commonly practiced in Europe included severing the tendons of the knees, so you couldn't get up and walk, or placing poppy seeds, millet, or sand on the ground at the gravesite of a presumed vampire. This was intended to keep the vampire occupied all night by counting the fallen grains. There is also some folklore that says that spirits or ghosts, if you throw grains of salt at them, that they will, or grains of rice, it's rice or salt, I can't remember, that if you throw those, that they are forced to count the grains and that it occupies them so they cannot haunt. Interesting. Okay, let's see. So they were counting the grains, indicating an association of vampires with erythromomania. Say that 5 times fast. Similar Chinese narratives state that if a vampiric being came across a sack of rice, it would have to count every grain. This is a theme that's encountered in myths from the Indian subcontinent, as well as in South American tales of witches and other sorts of evil or mischievous spirits or beings. So how do we identify vampires? Well, most of the time they're going to look like normal people, right? Because if they are still around, which I believe that they are, especially in Louisiana, I feel like, and that's a whole other tangent, but let's discuss. So in the state of Louisiana, there is rumored to be several clans or several dens of vampires. And they've been there for several hundred years. They've learned to assimilate into their way of life. They've learned to basically feed in secret. And there is said to be portals in Louisiana that you lose track of time. Now, especially in places like Bourbon Street, in the French Quarter, and there are many, many really old historic buildings there. Now, there's some that are rumored to have deities or entities in the attic that don't come out unless it's time to feed. There's rumors and there's stories of people that have gone down there to party and to goof off, that would go walking to explore and lose all track of time. There's been encounters with people that they say they know it was a vampire and they don't know how they escaped it. I came across a story a while back on TikTok where this woman was recounting another person's story of what happened to them and how they were partying with friends. They went to go dancing with a really attractive man. He went with them bar hopping throughout the evening. And as the night progressed, he offered to walk them back to their hotel. They accepted, and he asked to be invited in, which time they declined. They said they weren't comfortable with that, and he left. However, in the middle of the night, they heard a knock at the door, but neither one of them got up to answer it. So remember, vampires have to be invited in. So if you don't allow them to have permission to enter, 9 times out of 10, they can't get access. But if you are intoxicated, that is a totally different situation. It's said that entities of any kind, whether that's demonic or a vampire, can enter your person due to your basically like your guard being down, okay? And so there's this whole other thing called alcohol that we'll get into that's all about like the spirit of possession that can overtake you when you're inebriated, when you're drunk, when you're thoroughly intoxicated. And sometimes we see that in people that are really struggling with alcohol. I had a very similar experience many years ago, that it's like your personality changes. Think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? Very different personalities. And so I want to look that up really quick to give it to you. All right, so it's called alcohol, comes from the Arabic word al-kul, which means body-eating spirit. It is the worst drug in the world, and it is something that is easily accessible. So it can be there for a deliberate reason why alcohol is so easily accessible and other psychoactive substances are not. So think of it as something that would enter your spirit, okay? And they do call alcohol, especially hard liquor, spirits. Well, why do you think they call them that, right? Some of this actually comes from, we know that it is a negative thing and we shouldn't be partaking in some of it. Now, I'm not saying the occasional drink will lead to that. However, if you are constantly so intoxicated that you're blacking out, chances are there could be some sort of otherworld entity that is in your space. So let's get back to identifying vampires. So many rituals were used to identify a vampire. One method of finding a vampire's grave involved leading a virgin boy through a graveyard or church's grounds on a virgin stallion. The horse would supposedly balk at the grave in question. Generally, a black horse was required, though in Albania it should be white. Holes appearing in the earth over a grave were taken as a sign of vampirism. Corpses thought to be vampires were generally described as having a healthier appearance than expected, plump and showing little or no signs of decomposition. In some cases, when suspected graves were opened, villagers even described the corpse as having fresh blood from a victim all over its face. Evidence that a vampire was active in a given locality included death of cattle, sheep, relatives, or neighbors. Folkloric vampires could also make their presence felt by engaging in minor poltergeist-styled activity, such as hurling stones on roofs or moving household objects and pressing on people in their sleep. So, a lot of times the ones that I still feel are actually active in New Orleans would have fed on things that were easily accessible. And what also comes to mind is things like street workers, hookers, prostitutes, right? Because they're unlikely to have people coming looking for them. Also, homeless population, people who are tourists, things like that they just disappear and nobody can find them ever again. There's also so many instances of people that just randomly disappear, right? So maybe it's kidnapping, maybe it's serial killers, maybe it's vampires. Little do we know, okay? So how do we protect ourselves from these entities? So items to ward off revenants or vampires are common in vampire folklore. Garlic is a common example. A branch of wild rose and hawthorn are sometimes associated with causing harm to vampires. And in Europe, mustard seeds would be sprinkled on the roof of a house to keep them away. Other means to include or sacred items such as a crucifix, a rosary, or holy water. Some folklore also states that vampires are unable to walk on consecrated ground. Think of churches or temples or crossing running water. The running water thing was always weird to me. It's like, I'm not sure why they think that running water would stop a ghost, a spirit, a vampire. I don't really know where that one came from. It's like if they were human, water wouldn't hurt them, right? So that was a little bit strange. But the other things I've heard, things like holy water or crosses, things like that, right? We watch them freak out when they see things like that. So it's strange. It's like, where did these things come from? Because we've seen them in movies, right? I feel like all of us have seen something silly like that in a movie. It's like, so what would that really do to them? Likely, probably nothing. All right. Although not traditionally regarded as antotropic, mirrors have been used to ward off vampires when placed facing outwards on a door in some cultures. Vampires do not have a reflection and sometimes do not cast a shadow, perhaps as a manifestation of the vampire's lack of a soul or their weakness to silver. Again, a silver cross is one that I remember hearing about as kids that was like said to repel them. Mirrors, right? They couldn't see themselves. You wouldn't see a reflection. So you couldn't see them in a mirror. That was one way to tell. Like if you stood in front of a mirror and there was nothing there when you could see it with your own eyes, could be a ghost, could be a vampire. Let's see. The attribute is not universal. The Greek was capable of both reflections and shadow. So in the Greek culture, the Greek folklore, reflections and shadow were something that was actually seen. But it was used by Bram Stoker in the movie Dracula and has remained popular with subsequent authors and filmmakers. Some traditions also hold that a vampire cannot enter a house unless invited by the owner. After the first invitation, they can come and go as they please. Through folkloric vampires, they were believed to be more active at night. They were not generally considered vulnerable to sunlight. So again, another myth, right? We've all seen those too, where they are active at night. They're nocturnal. They're feeding in darkness, right? So that makes it even more scary. They're typically dressed in all black, right? So they blend in like a bat. I hope that we find out where the whole bat thing came from, right? Because we see them kind of shapeshift from humanoid into a bat and be able to fly. So, I mean, there's just so much to deal with the folklore of these vampires that it's kind of entertaining. All right, so let's see. So they can come and go as they please if they've been invited by the owner only one time. So if you give the okay to enter, they can enter always. There's no way to keep them out once you do that. Reports in 1693 and 1694 concerning sightings of vampires in Poland and Russia claimed that when a vampire's grave was recognized, eating bread baked with its blood mixed into the flour or simply drinking it granted the possibility of protection. Other stories, primarily the Arnold Paoli case, claimed the eating of dirt from the vampire's grave would have the same effect, right? So almost like if you ate the vampire's blood, that you were protected. I wouldn't recommend that on any reason whatsoever, but supposedly that or the dirt would have the same effect. Methods of destruction. So how do we destroy them? Methods of destroying suspected vampires varied, with staking the most commonly cited method, particularly in South Slavic cultures. Ash was the preferred wood in Russia and the Baltic states, or hawthorn in Serbia, with a record of oak in Silesia. Aspen was also used for stakes, as it was believed that Christ's cross was made from aspen. Aspen branches on the graves of purported vampires were also believed to prevent their rising at night. Potential vampires were most often staked through the heart, through the mouth, and though the mouth was targeted in Russia and northern Germany, and the stomachs in northeastern Serbia. So they targeted the heart, the mouth, and the stomach. Piercing the skin of the chest was a way of deflating the bloated vampire. This is similar to a practice of anti-vampire burial, burying sharp objects such as sickles with the corpse so that they may penetrate the skin if the body bloats sufficiently while transforming into a revenant or a vampire. So we understand that during the decaying process, that what happens is all of the gases and fluids in the body tend to create that bloat, right? And so that's why the practice of embalming became popular, because what it did was it drained all of the blood, the organs were then removed, and then embalming fluid was put in its place to preserve the body for the burial, for the funeral services, so that they looked a little bit more lifelike. So before all of that would happen, what would happen is that the body under decay would actually blow up. Okay, and so if you've ever seen like a beached whale, what happens is if they're not returned out to the ocean in a few days, that corpse will actually blow up, extend, get bloated, and the pressure of the gases has to go somewhere, so the body typically explodes. Pretty gross, right? So we learned a lot of things over the years, and we created things to keep that from happening. So decapitation was another preferred method in German and Western Slavic areas, with the head buried between the feet. So they would take the head off and they would place it by the feet. So they would sever the head to keep it from rising again. Let's see, it was buried between the feet, behind the buttocks, or away from the body. So almost gives a whole new meaning to put your head up your ass, right? Okay. This act was seen as a way of hastening the departure of the soul, which in some cultures was said to linger in the corpse. The vampire's head, body, or clothes could also be spiked and pinned to the earth to prevent rising. So they did a lot of crazy things to try and keep these vampires from coming back from the grave, right? And wreaking havoc on the people. Romani people drove steel or iron needles into a corpse's heart and placed bits of steel in the mouth, over the eyes, ears, and between the fingers at the time of burial. They also placed hawthorn in the corpse's sock, or drove a hawthorn stake through the legs. In a 16th century burial near Venice, a brick forced into the mouth of a female corpse has been interpreted as a vampire slaying ritual by the archaeologist who discovered it in 2006. In Bulgaria, over 100 skeletons with metal objects such as plow bits embedded into the torso have been discovered. Further measures included pouring boiling water over the grave or complete incineration of the body. In southeastern Europe, a vampire could also be killed by being shot or drowned, by repeating the funeral service, by sprinkling holy water on the body, or by exorcism. In Romania, garlic could be placed in the mouth, and as recently as the 19th century, the precaution of shooting a bullet through the coffin was taken. For resistant cases, the body was dismembered, and the pieces burned, mixed with water, and administered to the family members as a cure. In Saxon regions of Germany, a lemon was placed in the mouth of suspected vampires. So we've done a lot of crazy things to try and protect ourselves from all of these entities, none of which seem very pleasant for the people left behind. Tales of supernatural beings consuming the blood or flesh of the living have been found in nearly every culture around the world for many centuries. The term vampire did not exist in ancient times. Blood drinking and similar activities were attributes to demons or spirits who could eat flesh and drink blood. Even the devil was considered synonymous with the vampire. Almost every culture associates blood drinking with some kind of revenant or demon, and in some cases a deity. In some cases a deity. In India tales, Velatas, ghoulish beings that inhabit corpses have been compiled with the Battle Passi, a prominent story in the tales of King Viramadati and his nightly quest to capture an elusive one. Okay. I don't know how to say this. Pisasa, the returned spirits of evildoers or those who died insane, also bear vampiric attributes. The Persians were one of the first civilizations to have tales of blood-drinking demons. Creatures attempting to drink blood from men were depicted on excavated pottery shards. Ancient Babylonia and Assyria had tales of the mythical Latitu. Latitu? Let me try and pronounce that. Oh, interesting. This is also part of Lilith, and we've talked about Lilith in one of the other episodes. So Lilith, also spelled Lilit, Latitu, or Lilith, is a feminine figure in Mesopotamian and Jewish mythology, theorized to be the first wife of Adam and a primordial she-demon. Lilith is cited as having been banished from the Garden of Eden for disobeying Adam. Okay, so let's see. There are tales of Lilith, basically synonymous with giving rise to Lilith and her daughters, the Lilu, from Hebrew demonology. There we go, mouth, let's work. So Lilith was considered a demon and was often depicted as subsisting on the why can't my words work today? Subsisting on the blood of babies and female shape-shifting, blood-drinking demons. They were said to roam the night among the population seeking victims. Let's see. There were creatures that were also called in the twilight hours before God rested. An injured Estrie could be healed by eating bread and salt given to her by her attacker. Interesting. So the victims could potentially be treated by eating bread and salt that were given to her by her attacker. So let's say that you were attacked in the night by these entities, these bloodthirsty entities, that you could be healed by eating bread and salt. That seems pretty crazy, right? Bread and salt cured me. All right, so Greco-Roman mythology describes Impulse, the Lamia, and Mormo, and the Styges. Over time, the first two terms became general words to describe witches and demons, respectively. Impulsa was the daughter of the goddess Hecate and was described as demonic, a demonic bronze-footed creature. She feasted on blood by transforming into a young woman and seduced men as they slept before drinking their blood. The Lamia preyed on young children in their beds at night, sucking their blood, as did the Gello. Like the Lamia, the Styries feasted on children but also preyed on adults. They were described as having the bodies of crows or birds in general and were later incorporated into Roman mythology as Strix, a kind of nocturnal bird that fed on human flesh and blood. So close to the bat thing. I'm wondering if we're going to find the bat. So in Turkish mythology, it looks like Uber, U-B-I-R. Uber is a vampiric creature characterized by various regional depictions. According to legends, the individuals heavily steeped in sin and practitioners of black magic transform into Ubers upon their death, taking on bestial form within their grave. They possess the ability to shapeshift, assuming the forms of both humans and various animals. Furthermore, they can seize the souls of living beings and extort control over its body. Someone inhabited by a vampire constantly experiences hunger, becoming increasingly aggressive when unable to find sustenance, and ultimately resorting to drinking the human blood. Medieval and later European folklore. Many myths surrounding vampires originated during the medieval period. With the arrival of Christianity in Greece and other parts of Europe, the vampire began to take on decidedly Christian characteristics. As various regions of the continent converted to Christianity, the vampire was viewed as a dead person who retained a semblance of life and could leave its grave much in the same way that Jesus had risen after his death and burial and appeared before his followers. In the Middle Ages, the Christian churches reinterpreted vampires from their previous folklore existence into minions of Satan and used an allegory to communicate a doctrine to Christians. Just as a vampire takes a sinner's very spirit into itself by drinking its blood, so also can a righteous Christian, by drinking Christ's blood, take the divine spirit into himself. So that's interesting. So the interpretation of vampires under the Christian churches established connotations that are still associated in the vampire genre today. For example, the ability of the cross to hurt and ward off vampires is distinctly due to its Christian association. The 12th century British historians and chroniclers Walter Map and William of Newburgh recorded accounts of revenants, though records in English legends of vampiric beings after this date are scant. The Old Norse Draugr is another medieval example of an undead creature with similarities to vampires. Vampiric beings were rarely written about in Jewish literature. In the 16th century, Rabbi David ben Solomon, he's got like 8 names, Solomon Ibn Abi Zamara, wrote of an uncharitable old woman whose body was unregarded and unburned for 3 days after she died, and rose as a vampiric entity, killing hundreds of people. He linked this event to the lack of guarding after her death, as the corpse could be a vessel for evil spirits. That's so crazy. All right, in 1645, the Greek librarian of the Vatican, Leo Aletius, produced the first mythological description of the Balkan beliefs in vampires, or the Greek ones, in his work De Gregorium Hodie Coronandrum Openthyon Bias. Okay, I have no idea what that means. Uncertain modern opinions among the Greeks. That's the translation. Vampires properly originating in folklore were widely reported from Eastern Europe in the late 17th and 18th centuries. These tales formed the basis of the vampire legend that later entered Germany and England, where they were subsequently embellished and popularized. An early recording of the time came from the region of Istra in modern Croatia in 1672. Local reports described a panic among the villagers inspired by the belief that Jur Grando had become a vampire after dying in 1656, drinking blood from victims and sexually harassing his widow. The village leader ordered a stake to be driven through his heart. Later, his corpse was also beheaded. Interesting stories. From 1679, Philip Rohr devotes an essay to the dead who chew their shrouds in their graves, a subject resumed by Otto in 1732 and then by Michael Ranfit in 1734. The subject was based on the observation that when digging up graves, it was discovered that some corpses had at some point either devoured the interior fabric of their coffin or their own limbs. Ranft described in his treatise of a tradition in some parts of Germany that to prevent the dead from masquerading, they placed a mound of dirt under their chin in the coffin. They also placed a piece of money and a stone in their mouth, or tied handkerchiefs tightly around their throat. So they put a mound of dirt under their chin, placed money and stone in their mouth, and tied a handkerchief around their throat. In 1732, an anonymous writer's writing, as the Dr. Weimer, discussed the non-putrefaction of these creatures from the theological point of view. In 1733, Johann Christoph Herrenberg wrote a general writing on vampirism and cited local cases. Theologians and clergymen also addressed the topics. Some theological disputes arose. The non-decay of vampires' bodies could recall the incorruption of the bodies and of the saints of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Indeed, vampires were traditionally considered highly problematic within Christianity, as their apparent immortal existence ran against the Christian belief that all true believers may look forward to an eternal existence with body and soul as they were resurrected, but only at the end of times when Jesus returns to judge the living and the dead. Those who are resurrected as immortal before this are thus in no way part of the divine plan of salvation. The imperfect state of the vampire body and how they, in spite of their immortal nature, still needed to feed on the body or the blood of the living, further reflected the problematic aspect of the vampires. Contrary to how the incorruptible saints foreshadowed the immortality promised all true Christians at the end of time, the immortality of the undead vampires was thus not a sign of salvation, but of perdition. The unholy dimensions of vampirism may also be reflected in how in parts of Russia, the very word heretic was synonymous with a vampire. Whoever denied God or his commandments became a heretic after his death, the improperly immortal figure that wandered the night in search of people to feed on. So it just goes to show you there's just so much information about where the whole vampire controversy even came from. In the 18th century, vampire controversy, despite the decline of many popular folkloric beliefs during the Age of Enlightenment, there was a dramatic increase in the popular belief in vampires, resulting in mass hysteria throughout much of Europe. The panic began as with an outbreak of alleged vampire attacks in eastern Prussia in 1721, and in the Habsburg monarchy from 1725 to 1734, which spread to other localities. The first infamous vampire case involved the corpse of Peter Belovajek from Serbia. He was reported to have died at the age of 62, but allegedly returned after his death, asking his son for food. When the son refused, he was found dead the following day. He supposedly returned and attacked some neighbors who died from loss of blood. In the second case, Milos Caesar, an ex-soldier turned farmer who allegedly was attacked by a vampire years before, died while haying. After his death, people began to die in the surrounding area. It was widely believed that Milos had returned to prey on the neighbors. The Belovajek and Caesar incidents were well-documented cases. Government officials examined the bodies, wrote case reports, and published books throughout Europe. The problem was exacerbated by ritual epidemics of so-called vampire attacks, undoubtedly cases by the higher amount of superstition that was present in villages, communities, with locals digging up bodies and in some cases staking them. Even government officials engaged in hunting and staking of vampires. The hysteria, commonly referred to as the vampire controversy, continued for a generation. At least 16 contemporary writings discussed the theological and philosophical implications of the vampire epidemic. Let's see. There was another one published in 1751, which investigated and analyzed the evidence for vampirism. Numerous readers, including both Voltaire, who was critical, and numerous demonologists who were supportive, interpreted the writings as claimed that vampires existed. The controversy in Austria ceased when Empress Maria Theresa sent her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate the claims of vampiric entities. Van Swieten concluded that vampires did not exist, and the Empress passed laws prohibiting the opening of graves and the desecration of the bodies, thus ending the vampire epidemic. Other European countries followed suit. Despite this condemnation, the vampire lived on in artistic works and in local folklore. So what do you guys think? Do you guys think that vampires are real? Do you guys think that they still exist today? Do you think you've ever come across one? Do you think that they still exist in regular population today in places like Europe or places like Louisiana? Do you think that you would know how to spot one? What would you do if you encountered one? Little food for thought today. So our next episode, we're going to be discussing werewolves. I hope you'll stay tuned. Have a great rest of your week.